Well, hello again and welcome to the Great British Woodshop. Today I thought I'd build myself a wine rack. Now I'm always interested to see how pieces of furniture have translated through time, and I found a really interesting piece at a fabulous property called Claydon House in Buckinghamshire. The name Verney was notable in the 17th century because Sir Edmund went into battle during the Civil War as King Charles's standard bearer, and the story goes that he died clutching the flag, and he's buried at All Saints Church, which is right next to Claydon House. Since the 1400s, family fortunes have soared and plummeted, but most of the land, as well as part of the house, is still family owned, and occupied now by the current Sir Edmund Verney. Now here's an interesting piece. The pineapple on top represents hospitality, and this urn, made of mahogany, is zinc lined, and guests would come and rinse out their wine glasses from here. In the cabinet underneath, there's a space in here for a chamber pot, and guests again would come, I'm told, and relieve themselves in the chamber pot and then help themselves to a bottle of wine from the wine storage. Now I've got no use for this part, but a good wine storage area could come in handy. Well, I'm a bit embarrassed to say that what you're looking at is the David Free wine cellar, and I've had this around the house for years. I think I picked this up at a market for about £1. But it was functional, and it was big enough to hold a wine bottle or a champagne bottle, and of course wine needs to be stored laying down to keep the cork moist. So here's the upgrade. I built it big enough to hold 42 bottles, and the bottles just slide in on these triangular runners. At the bottom I put a decorative cutout, and a drawer up here for any corkscrews and essentials. And at the top here on the serving back, I put some nice profile detail. Now, Claydon had a decorative pineapple on top of theirs, and I've gone for a wooden carved grape ornament. And the whole thing is built out of solid maple, with the exception of the back, which is maple veneered MDF. And the first thing I'm going to do is make the side panels. Well, I take every precaution I can when I'm working with these shop tools. I wear eye protection and ear defenders when they're called for. And I always make sure that the safety guards are in place. And anytime I ever take them off is so you can see a little bit more clearly what we're actually doing. Now, a few passes over this jointer will turn this piece of stock into a nice flat board. Next, I'll rotate the board and put the planed side up against the fence and run it over the jointer to give me a square edge. Then it's through the thickness planer a few times until I get the thickness down to 19mm. And then I'll cut it to width at the table saw and then clean up that sawn edge over back at the jointer. And finally I'll cut it to length at 856mm. In addition to the two side panels, the carcass consists of a top, which is joined here with biscuits, and a drawer shelf, which is joined with a stopped groove. And down here at the base, that sits in a groove that runs all the way through. The MDF back panel sits flush with the back of the cabinet because it sits in rebates that I'm also going to mill in both the side pieces. I spent a couple of minutes marking up the side, and the first thing I did was to put a line 75mm from the bottom. And I've set a straight edge guide in place to guide the base of my router, and the distance from the line is exactly the distance from the flat edge to the cutter. And I've installed a 19mm wide cutter and set the depth to 10mm. Now I can cut a groove all the way through for the base to sit in. I'm set up now to cut a groove for the drawer shelf, but this time I'm going to stop the groove 20mm short of the front of the cabinet. Well, now I've made the final adjustments here on the router table, and I can cut the rebate for the back panel. And the bottle dividers sit in grooves in the drawer shelf, and they're stopped grooves because I don't want to see any cutout up here in the front of the cabinet. And down here at the base, the grooves can go all the way through because the skirting board will cover that up. And here are the rebates completed in the sides, and I've also completed the grooves in the drawer shelf, and I've stopped them short of the front of the cabinet. Now I'm set up to cut the grooves in the base, and I've installed a 12.7mm cutter, which is a clean shear cut cutter. Now these cutters are especially designed for cutting grooves, and you'll notice that the cutting edge here is raked at an angle, and that's what prevents it furring up. With the straight edge guide in place, I'm now ready to cut that groove. The back panel will come out of this 13mm thick piece of maple veneered MDF, The length was 856, and now I'm ready to cut the width, which is 655. I'm just using the side panels as a reference guide, setting it over the back panel. I'm going to mark with a pencil in these grooves. The top groove is for the drawer divider, and this one down here is for the base. And then I'll join those two lines up, and I'll route those out next. Let's check this for fit. That looks pretty good. Now I'll use the same technique as I did before to mark out for where the bottle dividers will go. Just marking the grooves, and then I'll join those lines together and we'll route those out. Now because the bottle dividers are narrower, I'm changing the bit for a 12.7mm cutter. Each of these vertical panels has these bottle dividers attached to them, but before I can do that I need to notch out the top of the panel so it can sit in the stopped groove on the underside of the drawer shelf. I've attached a piece of scrap ply to my miter gauge, and that's just so I can hold this work securely, and I've come in and marked a line 6mm from the end of this vertical panel. I've set the blade to 20mm high, and I'll just line the sawtooth up with that mark, and then I'll nibble it away. Now I need 84 of these little triangular runners. And firstly, I milled up some stock 28mm square, and I've attached a piece of MDF onto my rip fence, and it's acting as a sacrificial fence because I want the blade to bite into it. And I've got these clamps on there holding it securely in place, but the clamps are high enough to let this stock pass through underneath them. Now I need to hold that flat against the fence, and to do that I'm going to use this featherboard. It's a magnet, and it sticks to the bed of the saw table. And the little fin on the side here will keep the stock nicely up against the fence, and this little wing on top will hold the stock down. And that way it'll stop it from moving away. And when I get to the end, as I push it through, I'll use this stick to keep my fingers away from the blade. I've cut them all to length so that they're 6mm short of the back of the panel, and that's where this will sit into the back panel. And also I've come up 6mm and put a couple of marks, and this distance here will allow me to recess it into the base. Now I'm just going to hold it in place and drive in some brads. 2 from the bottom and 1 from the top. All the rest go in at 95mm peak to peak, and they get the same brads. And I'll just keep working my way up until I get to the top, and then I'll flip it over and do the other side. I've finished putting together all the vertical dividers, and I've started dry assembling the cabinet. Now before I can complete that, I need to notch out the drawer shelf so it'll sit in this stop groove. And again, I've set up my sliding miter gauge with my fence, and I've lined up the drawer shelf. I've put a mark that's 10mm in, and I've raised the blade up to 30mm, and I'll just nibble it away. The drawer shelf's in, and it fits pretty well. And I've just held everything together with some clamps while I get some exact measurements for the skirting board. Now this is the front, and I had a look at both sides of this piece, and I like this side much better. The grain pattern is a lot prettier than the other side. So I'll keep that as the front. Now to get the overall length, I'm going to do a little trick. Now this board will be mitered in that direction, and this board will be mitered in that direction. So to get this outside point from here on the edge of the skirting board to the other side, I can rotate this board around, just hold it in place, and then I can use my pencil to mark up the front of the board, and the same on the other side. And that point there will be where I'll cut the miter back over on the table saw. The 2 side pieces also get cut at 45 degrees, and I'll trim them to length later. Next I'm going to make these decorative cutouts, and I've started marking out the board. I found a center line and then divided it into equal parts, and I'm just using a coin to mark the corners. And then just in here I'm freehanding a little curve. I'll do the same on this side. And then I'm going to cut this out with a jigsaw and sand it back with the oscillating spindle sander. Well, during the break I'm going to finish up this skirting board, and when we come back I'm going to start gluing up the wine rack. Well, welcome back to the Great British Woodshop. Today's project is a wine rack. In the first half we built this Carcass, and when we went to break I was in the middle of cutting out this decorative part on the front skirting board with the jigsaw. I finished that and I sanded it back to the line, and I also added some miters on the corners. Now the next thing I want to do is create a bevel on the top edge of all of these pieces, and I'm going to do that over here on the jointer. Now I could tip the fence on this jointer over to 45 degrees and push the board through, but I feel that with the fence tipped in this position it's quite easy for this board to drift away. And fortunately this fence will tip to both sides of 90, and I think this is a better position to have it in, and I'll be able to keep this piece tightly up against the fence, and a few passes over the jointer knives will remove that material. Well, here's our beveled piece of skirting board, and that fits very nicely. Happy with that. And I'm almost ready for some glue up. This is the cavity that the drawer will sit in, and this is the Carcass top. Now there'll be another top go on after this, a serving top, but this piece just gets secured in place with some biscuits. Let's check this for fit. That fits pretty good. Well, this serving top gets attached to the Carcass top with 4 screws, 2 here and 2 here, and they get fastened from underneath. Now this cavity is just so small it's incredibly hard to get my hand in there and a screwdriver to try and tighten those down. So the solution I came up with was to drill some clearance holes in this drawer divider, and that's to enable me to get a screwdriver bit to pass through there, and then I can get up into the screws in the top and tighten them down. Now I'm still going to take some skin off my knuckles on this, I'm sure, but it's a lot easier to get my hand in there than up in there. And I'm going to drill these out with a 7mm brad point bit. Well, now I'm going to use the drawer divider to mark the positions for some more holes that I'm going to drill in the Carcass top. I'm just going to line it up with the front edge and the sides and use that 7mm drill bit, because obviously it's the same size as the hole I just drilled, but it's got a nice point on it, and I'll use it as a marker. I'll just mark that. And there. And these holes are going to be shank holes for some number 10 screws. Now this is a gadget I just would not be without in the workshop. It's a vernier caliper. I use it all the time. And the diameter of these screws is 4.8 to 4.9 mil. So I'm going to drill a 5mm shank hole to give clearance for this screw to pass all the way through it. And I'll do that back at the drill press as well. Well, now I'm ready to glue up, and this drawer divider just goes in dry to help me locate these center pieces. A little bit of glue in the trench. And this is going to just slot into there. I'm going to hold it in place by toenailing a couple of brads. And I'll do the same with the other 4 bottle dividers, working from the middle to the outside. The base and the drawer divider go in next, and it's just glue in these, no brads. And while the Carcass is drying, let's build the drawer. Now this drawer is a typical construction, dovetail joints at the front, and there's a groove at the back that holds the back panel. And there's also a groove that runs down both the side pieces and across the front, and that's where the base gets housed. To cut these dovetailing joints, I'm using a dovetailing jig, and I've got my router bit, which is a dovetailing bit set up in my small router. And you can see the shape of that bit, and you can see how it's going to remove this section and the bottom one here in this side panel. That's the piece I've clamped in here first. The guide bush that I've got installed in the base of the router rides in these fingers and these tail guides, and it'll ride in here first, removing this end section, skip over here, ride in this one, remove the middle bit, again skip over that, and then remove the last piece here. And the board that I've got clamped in here is just a backer board that'll stop any tear out as I push the router bit through the side piece. Well, there's the pins cut in the side. Now to cut the front, I just need to turn this over. The front goes face down. And before I do that, I'm just going to replace these pins, the guide fingers, for these. Now I put some little pencil marks on here just to allow me to line these pins up. They just clip in. And I'm setting the depth, just using the side panel as a guide. This sets the depth of the pins. Just tighten that up. And the last pin guide can go in there. Well, now I'll cut the grooves in the two side panels and in the front for that base piece. I'll run each piece through once, and then I'll adjust the fence over a couple of mil and run them through again. And the second cut will create a groove that's 6 mil wide, and that'll take the drawer bottom. The drawer back sits in 2 grooves in each of the side panels, and I've installed a straight cutting bit in the router table. I've raised it up so it's 6 mil above the surface, and I've set the fence 10 mil from the edge of the cutter, and I'll make those grooves next. The first thing to get glued up is the dovetails, and dovetail joints are always used on drawers because they're so strong, and what makes them strong is the amount of glue surfaces that there are, because you've got these pins going, the tails going into the pins, and there's just an awful lot of area that gets covered in glue. Plus, of course, the nature of the joint means that it's pulling against itself, so it just doesn't come apart. The base goes in. No glue on that. And then the back panel slides into those trenches that I cut before. And I'll just fasten those down with a couple of brads. And just a couple of brads in the drawer bottom to hold it in place. Now the skirting boards go on the side first. I'm not putting much glue on here because we're in a cross-grain condition here between these 2 bits of wood. This wood being solid maple, both pieces are. This wants to expand this way, this wants to expand this way. So I'm just going to put a little bit of glue at the end here, and then I'll hold it in place with a clamp while I attach it with some 30 mil finish nails. The front skirting board just gets attached with some glue and a couple of biscuits here in the front just to help locate it in the right place. And then I'll hold the whole lot together with a band clamp. While that dries, we'll get started working on the serving top. Well, I'm going to get the serving top out of these 2 pieces. And some people might throw this away, but I think this piece of wood is a beautiful thing. I found this down at the timber yard, and it was due for the scrap yard, and I managed to salvage it. This is actually a diseased part of the tree that the tree's grown around. And once that's jointed to this piece, I think it'll make a lovely character feature top. But the first thing I need to do is clean up this edge. So I'm going to do that with the first cut on the table saw, and then I'll clean up the second cut on the jointer. These 2 boards get joined with 4 biscuits. I'm just marking the positions for the biscuit slots. And then I'll cut those, then put some glue on it, put it in the clamps, and then put it aside to dry. I'm going to get the last bit of detail on the backsplash using a Roman ogee bit installed in the handheld router. Well, here's the top all sanded, and it's come out pretty well, I think. I cut it to length and to width, and the next thing I want to do is add a decorative bead around the outside. And to do that, I've changed the bit in the router to a Roman ogee edge molding bit, and that's going to give me a wider profile. I came up 15 mil on both sides, and I'll start here, go all the way around and finish on the other side. The backsplash gets attached to the top with 4 screws. I've clamped it together and marked positions for the screws, and I'm just going to drill a pilot hole for some number 8 screws. Well, we're getting close to finishing this project. I've just clamped the top on here temporarily so I can mark out the positions for the pilot holes that'll get drilled into the top. And I'm just going to use my clearance hole to pass a screwdriver bit through and put a screw into that hole, and I'll just tap it with a hammer. I only want this pilot hole to go in about 10 mil, so I've put a little piece of white tape here as an indicator to tell me when to stop. Now it's going to be hard enough to get my hands in that small cavity, so I'm going to give myself a little advantage by just tapping a thread part way into this hole. It's quite often when you bring your router bit around and you slow down on the corners, or where I've stopped down here at the back, the router will actually burn the wood. So I'm just using my little triangular base sander to get into the curve very carefully and remove any of that burn. Well, I did the same to the top profile on the backsplash, and I'm now giving it all a sand with some 240 grit paper. And then I'll attach it to the top of the cabinet with 4 45mm number 8 screws. The wine rack gets crowned off with this piece of carved moulding. Now, I bought this because it'd probably take me about a year to carve something like this. It's made from solid maple, and although it looks hand-carved, it's probably done by machine. It really makes me appreciate the amount of work Lightfoot and his guys did when they were carving all of that work down at Claydon House. Now, I'm going to apply some glue to the back of this. This is a wood moulding glue. And I don't want to put too much on here because it's so close to the edge, it's likely to spread out and it'll be hard to clean up. I'll just put a little bit around. Now, it needs to be positioned right in the center. And now it's in position, it's going to be too hard to clamp, so I'm just going to use some weight. I've just got some boxes of nails, but any weight will do. It'll be dry in about 10 minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to drill a couple of holes in the drawer front and put on some knobs. I've vacuumed the piece off thoroughly, and I'm just wiping it over with this tack cloth, which is just a cloth impregnated with some sticky resin. And that'll remove any excess dust that's still there. Now, the finish I'm going to use for this is Danish oil. And oil is a good choice because it'll penetrate the wood and it'll feed the wood, and you can always continue to apply more finishes until you get the colour that you actually want. And this looks pretty dark in the glass here, but it doesn't dry that way, and it certainly doesn't go on that way, and I'm really looking forward to finding out how this is going to turn out. Let's just put a bit on. Look at that come up. Look at that colour. That is beautiful. Now, I'm doing this in sections because I want to leave the oil on there for about 10 minutes and then wipe it off with a clean rag. That'll just spread the oil around evenly. And then after this whole piece is dry, I'm going to give it a sanding, light sanding in between coats, and I'll probably end up putting about 4 coats on this. And then once that's done, I can fill it up with my favourite wine. Well, I've nearly got the wine rack fully stocked, and I think it's time to open a bottle of champagne and celebrate. I hope to see you again soon on the Great British Woodshop. I'm David Free.